Welcome, everyone, to the Tools for Increasing Housing Production in Your Community conference. I am Rachel Heller, CEO of CHAPA, and on behalf of CHAPA and our co-sponsors, MassHousing, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, Ed Marchant, an EHM real estate advisor, and the law offices of Paul Haverty at Blattman, Bobrowski, Haverty, and Silverstein. Welcome to our three-part series on increasing housing production in your community and meeting your community's housing needs. And thank you to CHAPA sponsors who are recognized on the slides. This is the group that is making it possible for us to be able to deliver programming like this. I'd also like to thank the CHAPA team, in particular, Carol Marine, for all of the work that has gone into organizing this three-part series. CHAPA's mission is to encourage the production and preservation of homes that are affordable for families and individuals with low and moderate incomes, and to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. CHAPA advocates for opportunity, expands access to housing, and develops the field. With the Tools Conference, we are doing all three, highlighting opportunities within communities, offering approaches to expanding access to housing, and developing the affordable housing and community development field by providing a platform for our statewide experts to share their expertise with you. The Tools Conference is a post-COVID reimagining of our classic Chapter 40B conference that CHAPA, along with our partners, has organized for over 20 years. When we emerged from COVID in 2022, we were energized by the new housing tools that had become law during the pandemic. This includes housing choice, lowering the voting threshold for changing zoning to really facilitate more housing production, the MBTA Communities Act, which we all lovingly know as 3A, which is for 177 communities served by the MBTA to put the zoning in place that allows for multifamily development. The new ability for judges to require abutters post bonds in an effort to reduce frivolous lawsuits and enable the housing production we need. And most recently, the Affordable Homes Act, a $5.2 billion housing bond bill with many new rental and homeownership production programs, as well as policies meant to help communities really bring on the homes that we need. So these new tools stand alongside the tried and true programs that really make Massachusetts unique in this country. There's a long commitment to affordable housing and housing production. Programs that you all know, Chapter 40R, our Smart Growth Housing Production Program, Chapter 40T, the country's strongest environmental preservation law, and of course, Chapter 40B, which has been the most effective tool for creating multifamily housing outside of our major cities. So our reimagined conference allows us the opportunity to explore the use of both the tried and true laws and programs that we've got and the new tools that we have for housing production and for furthering fair housing and ensuring affordability as we grow our overall housing stock. We're committed at CHAPA to ensuring that every resident in Massachusetts has the opportunity to choose where they live, free from discrimination, and we now have more tools at our disposal to make this happen. This year, our expert panels will focus on three areas of interest that are critical to housing in your community. Today, our panel will demystify the role of the subsidizing agencies in housing production. And next week, we will dive into fair housing challenges and with some of the new tools that are being rolled out by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. In our last session, you will hear about the use of inclusionary zoning to ensure housing affordability in your community. Before we hear today's panel, we have a very special keynote speaker to open the session and to open our conference and share his insights about housing production. A mere 18 months ago, Ed Augustus was appointed by Governor Healy to serve as the first secretary of the new Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, a cabinet-level office signifying the importance of creating housing for all Massachusetts residents. With a background in city management and a commitment to building more faster, I love that, Secretary Augustus has approached housing production in two critical ways. He has built a strong and diverse staff to identify challenges and come up with the best solutions possible. And at the same time, Secretary Augustus spends more time traveling the state than just about anyone I know, meeting with community leaders, housing authorities, developers, landlords, and tenants, really hearing from communities about what they see as their needs and how the state can partner with communities to drive housing production for all and to develop a comprehensive development and stabilization strategy. We are so pleased to have Secretary Augustus here to share his vision for producing the safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable homes in every community, homes that will be developed in partnership with so many of you. Please join me with your Zoom applause hands in welcoming Secretary Ed Augustus to the conference.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Appreciate that very kind introduction. Hopefully you see my halo coming through behind me here.
You have kind of a halo effect.
Again, thank you to you, and thank you to CHAPA, to your board, to all of your staff. You're all amazing partners in all that we do. All those great things that you just talked about are really accomplishments that couldn't have happened without CHAPA's partnership and leadership and expertise. So I profoundly want to say thank you to you and your team. Expanding housing opportunities is a top priority of the Healey-Driscoll administration, and we couldn't do it without an array of partners, including CHAPA and many other folks who are on this Zoom today. We're locked arm in arm with us together, working to make change. The tide of unaffordability that we are working to combat has been rising for decades. For decades, people have said no to multifamily housing, no to low-income earners, and many times no to the very people who keep our communities functioning and running. Some communities have historically used zoning to build virtual fences around the that are increasingly keeping all but the fortunate out. Everything we are doing at Housing and Livable Communities is intended to undo decades of no. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a landmark step in combating discrimination in housing, yet today we are still fighting that battle. The Affordable Homes Act was one big step toward ensuring equal access to housing regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or disability. And I want to thank again all of the partners that we've had in getting this important piece of legislation over the finish line and getting the governor's signature this past August. An important part of the Affordable Homes Act was creating an Office of Fair Housing within our new secretariat. I'm excited to announce that this week we will be posting a job listing for the first ever director of Fair Housing. This individual will lead the planning at HLC to overcome patterns of segregation in our housing and support enforcement and education around our fair housing laws. With their help, we'll foster a more inclusive communities and improve access to opportunities. So if you know anyone who you think would be a good fit for this job, please encourage them to look at the posting. We have it on our HLC LinkedIn page, or they could visit bass.gov/careers. But we really are looking for some good candidates to help fill this important role. And as we continue to implement the 49 policy provisions of the Affordable Homes Act, we are also turning our attention to planning for the future. That means developing a plan for affordability, a plan for sustainability, and a plan for zoning reform. So how do you plan for zoning? Well, one of the most impactful ways right now is the MBTA Communities Law, as Rachel alluded to. This is such an important piece of a more equitable future for everyone in our state. Because when it comes to building housing, it really starts with zoning. You can't build something that isn't allowed by zoning. So although there are a few communities who've been dragging their feet, and they tend to get a lot of the attention and a lot of the attention, we need to spread the news about the efforts that are underway here that are working. This spring, we saw a wave of communities adopting new multifamily zoning. And as of today, 83 communities have now embraced multifamily zoning. That's 83 communities saying yes to housing. 83 communities saying yes to municipal workers, teachers, and healthcare workers having a place to live in their community. 83 communities saying yes to the worker who passes you something over the counter when you're picking up your coffee in the morning or having a bite to eat. 83 communities saying yes to a future where Massachusetts is not only a great place to live, but a great place where everyday people can afford to live. The impact from this will have profound implications going forward, making Massachusetts more equitable for generations to come. Every time a community adopts zoning in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, we strike another blow to income inequality. Every time a community adopts multifamily zoning, it promotes social and economic equity. Every time a community adopts multifamily zoning, it takes another step toward creating a more diverse, inclusive, and livable community. And I'm proud to say that we're seeing tangible results already. Due to the work that these communities are doing, we already have more than 2,500 new units in the pipeline in those MBTA community zones. That's homes for thousands of people. And we're looking forward to seeing that number continue to grow in the coming months as more communities adopt multifamily zoning, as they work to identify opportunities to build. But we need each of you to show up in those cities and towns where you live, advocating for those zoning changes. Building more housing, and specifically multifamily housing, will go a long way to wrangling our housing crisis under control. But we also need to work to increase affordability in other ways, and that's where we need your help. You can work with your communities to ensure that a certain percentage of the units in new housing developments above a certain size or deed restriction as affordable for low and moderate income households. Inclusionary zoning increases affordable housing. It's good for the economy, and it helps prevent displacement. And how do we do sustainability? As we embark on our building more housing, we need to continue to think about how we are building our housing stock. Every one of our communities should be creating a housing production plan, which is a proactive strategy for planning and developing affordable housing. We're doing this now as a statewide level. Housing Advisory Commission works to build the state's first 5-year housing plan. This plan will outline what we know about housing challenges facing Massachusetts, and importantly, set out bold and achievable goals for housing production. That will include goals specific to each region in our state. This will not be a plan on the shelf. It will establish concrete, actionable strategies that will guide the actions we take in the coming years. But it's also important that this happen at the city and town level as well. This provides an opportunity for people at the community level to provide the input into the plan and the development of housing that meets their needs. Without a housing plan in place, our communities are leaving their future to chance. And I've traveled the state, as Rachel alluded to, and I've seen that the housing crisis that impacts us has a slightly different flavor from one community to the other. In one community, workforce housing may be the highest priority. In another, it might be the need for more senior housing, so that seniors in big homes looking to downsize have an affordable place to move to. And in another, affordable housing ownership might be the highest priority. That opportunity to give more people access to the housing market and the opportunities to create intergenerational wealth. A housing plan allows communities to answer not only what kind of housing we need most, but who in the community has been impacted by climate change. What are the infrastructural needs needed to ensure that both current and future needs are met? Whatever the highest need is, we need to help our communities focus on the solutions. And as I look ahead at our journey, I'm filled with optimism. Zoning changes are happening. Passage of the Affordable Homes Act is unlocking more funding and better housing policies. The work of our commissions is paving a road ahead. Now it's time for us to double down our efforts by putting these tools to work while focusing on the next solutions we need. So I continue to look forward to working with all of you, and again, appreciate the partnership, appreciating you coming together educating yourself, supporting each other. I know you got a great panel. We've got a couple of folks from our team on that panel that really do the work here day in and day out. So with that, I'll turn it back to Rachel, and just again, thank you for the work you do, and thanks for inviting me here today.
Thank you so much, Secretary Augustus. It's really a pleasure to work with you. And I just want to thank you for your leadership, your incredibly hard work, your optimism, and for laying out such a broad strategy that highlights production in every community for all people based on their needs. I'm also very excited to hear about the hiring of the new director of the Office of Fair Housing. So like our scoop that we've got at the conference already. We will now, thank you. We will now move to today's panel to talk about the implementation of our production programs and take an in-depth and get an in-depth understanding of the roles of the subsidizing agencies. I have the honor of introducing Chris Kluchman. Chris serves as the director of the Livable Communities Division at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Not only is she and her team responsible for supporting communities and evaluating progress under the MBTA Communities Act, but Chris is a really generous leader who supports communities and partners in state government in expanding housing opportunities, sharing her knowledge, and being just a tremendous resource. So I'll now turn it over to Chris Kluchman, who will introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Rachel. That's such a very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm really thrilled to have so many people here today to just get a deeper dive on production programs and how they work. We'll be having a panel presentations, and then you'll have an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. So yes, as in my work as the director of the Livable Communities Division, I get the privilege of helping communities with this wonderful new law, the MBTA Communities. I also oversee grant programs, the Community Development Block Group, and many different kinds of land use programs that have been, some of them longer standing and some of them newer, such as the accessory dwelling units. But I'm really looking forward to this presentation today, where you're going to hear from subsidizing agencies such as MassHousing Partnership, and my colleague Rieko here at Housing and Livable Communities, who runs the local initiative program. They're going to, these subsidizing agencies provide funding for developers seeking to use the provisions of Chapter 40B and the regulations and guidelines that implement that very important law. So when municipalities interact with subsidizing agencies, it may be a little bit of a one-off. You may do this once every 5 years. You may have never done it as a professional. And so you may not be familiar with exactly how these programs work, what and why the subsidizing agencies are sending you correspondence and you and your select board or city councils, what information they need back from you, and exactly how the programs work. So this session will provide you with an overview of the roles of the subsidizing agencies and the programs that operate Chapter 40B. In the questions and answers, you may have the chance to, you'll have the chance to ask them about how these work and how they interact with other state laws, such as how does 40B and MBTA communities work together or not work together. So what I'd like to ask folks to do is, if you do have questions during the session, write them in the chat, and I will be looking at those while my colleagues are giving their presentations, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. So I'd like to introduce Jessica Malcolm, who's the Manager of Plannings and Programs Department at MassHousing. She's going to talk about the role of the subsidizing agencies. Following Jess's presentation is Rieko Hayashi, the Local Initiatives Program Director here at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and she's going to give an overview of the LIP program. We'll be joined by our colleague Katie Lacey, who works at MassHousing Partnership during the question and answer period, who will be able to add their that quasi-public agency's insight as well. So thank you, everybody. Look forward to the session. Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks, Secretary Augustus. I apologize. I'm a little under the weather. Anybody that has kids know that it's kind of a tough time of year. So if I take a water break or two, please forgive me. My name is Jessica Malcolm, and I manage the Planning and Programs Department at MassHousing. The department's primary role is the administration of 40B programs. Our role is mission-oriented and results in the production of mixed income multifamily and single family housing outside of Boston and across the Commonwealth. Next slide, please, David. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'm just going to go over kind of the background of 40B and what it is before I jump into what the subsidizing agency's roles are. So what is 40B? It's a statute that was adopted in 1969 and is sometimes referred to as the Comprehensive Permit Law or the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. It enables local zoning boards of appeals to override local zoning and approve housing developments under flexible rules if at least 20 to 25% of the proposed housing units have long-term affordability restrictions. 40B encourages a minimum of at least 10% of a community's total housing units to be considered affordable to people earning 80% or less of an area median income. Communities that meet this 10% threshold or other safe harbor provisions, such as the GLAM or the general land area minimum, which is the 1.5% of the land area, housing affordable units, or a certified housing production plan, a sufficient number of units produced for the housing plan. That's another safe harbor provision. So communities that have met any of these safe harbor provisions have greater discretion in approving or denying comp permits. About 71 of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts have reached that 10% threshold. This figure includes Boston, although Boston is exempt from 40B otherwise. Next slide, please. So why do we need 40B? So 40A is the Commonwealth's zoning enabling legislation, which allows cities and towns to control their own zoning through local ordinances and bylaws. So as a result, Massachusetts has some of the smallest zoning jurisdictions in the country. Much of the zoning outside of the largest cities looks like this. One single family residence on a lot the size of a football field at Gillette Stadium. So that's approximately 1.3 acres. This, of course, results in very little room for the development of denser single family housing or multifamily housing in communities outside of the cities. So while 40B has its challenges, I think this depiction really drives home the importance of the statute and the significance of this land use tool. Next slide, please. So getting into the subsidizing agency's role, there are 4 subsidizing agencies designated to issue project approvals by EOHLC. The first is EOHLC, which runs the local initiative program and also oversees tax credit projects or any other capital funding. There's MassHousing Partnership, which MassHousing is often confused with. It's another quasi-public. It has oversight for projects for which MHP makes a loan. Then there's Mass Development. Same, they oversee projects for which they are the lender. And then there's MassHousing. Next slide, please, David. MassHousing is responsible for both programs for projects in which it finances, but also for projects permitted under the New England Fund program. I think it's important to call out because I want to say over 80% of the 40B project approvals are sought through the New England Fund program. And that's because there is a little bit more flexibility because developers are allowed to use third-party New England Fund program lenders for financing rather than state or agency financing. Next slide, please. So this slide is a diagram. Oops. There you go. This slide is a diagram of the life cycle of a 40B. So if you start down here on it's my left-hand corner, I don't know if it's your, but it's at number 1. The developer applies to MassHousing or the subsidizing agency for what's called site approval or project eligibility. The findings that are made by a subsidizing agency at this stage are prescribed by the set of regulations that covers 40B and any corresponding program guidelines, which include considering the appropriateness of a site for residential use, suitability with regard to surrounding context of the proposal, and financial feasibility. If a project is approved by a subsidizing agency, basically the developer uses this project eligibility letter as a ticket to approach their local zoning board of appeals for a comprehensive permit. The comprehensive permit is would be issued by the ZBA, and it's an all-encompassing permit which subsumes all permits and approvals normally issued by other local boards. So in effect, it expedites the permitting process. If a permit is denied by a municipality, and the municipality is entitled to deny a permit on the basis that local concerns about the project outweigh the need for affordable housing, which is a tough burden to overcome, I understand, or conditions are imposed in the permit that would make the project uneconomic for the developer is entitled to appeal this decision to the Housing Appeals Committee, which is sort of a neutral party administered out of HLC. Appeals of HAC decisions are sought through the conventional court system up through the SJC. If a comprehensive permit is received, the developer then has to return to the subsidizing agency for what's known as final approval. At this stage, understanding that a project evolves from project eligibility through final approval, the subsidizing agency has to reaffirm its original project eligibility findings. You know, essentially that the original 7 findings that we had to make, we have to remake them at final approval in case there were any modifications to the project. We also at that stage will ensure that other subsidy but program requirements are being met. We look at financing terms, and we review the affirmative fair housing marketing and lottery plan, and ensure all obligations are being met by the developer. Once final approval is received, the developer can essentially use that letter as a ticket to the municipality for building permits, and that's when construction commences. Once a development is substantially complete, the developer then has to return to the subsidizing agency once again for what's known as cost certification or the cost examination, because there are limitations on profits for developers and for distributions and rental projects. In homeownership projects, profits for developers are limited to 20% of the total allowable development costs. In rental projects, distributions from capital sources and operations are limited to 10%. Next slide, please, David. So bear with me. I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but I think the text is actually really important. So I just want to take a minute to back up to the project eligibility stage to go over what's referred to as the planning defense for municipalities against 40B development. So before a municipality's safe harbor status needs to be addressed at the comprehensive permit stage, the municipality has the opportunity to assert what's called the planning defense at the project eligibility or site approval stage. Again, I think the exact language is important, especially in the context of 3A. Essentially, the regulations allow a municipality to assert that its previous municipal action, so including by right creation of multifamily districts or compact neighborhoods, overlay districts under Chapter 40R, or an adoption of an inclusionary zoning bylaw, have resulted in what's can be seen as significant opportunity as measured by that 10% statutory minima. So any of these, you know, the 40R or the inclusionary zoning or the multifamily districts need to really result in the production of affordable housing units that can be added to that 10% statutory minima. Next slide, please, David. So what's Chapter 40B's impact? Chapter 40B has supported almost all of the affordable housing construction in Massachusetts outside of the Commonwealth's largest cities, since the statute was enacted in 1969. So more than 80,000 units of total units of housing, so mixed income, have been created. More than 20,000 of those are restricted to households that are making less than 80% of the AMI. Next slide, please. So that's kind of a, it's an overview of what a subsidizing agency does. Obviously Chapter 40B and the programs and the regulations are nuanced and complicated. And so here's my contact information if you have any questions that would dive deeper than what I went over today. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Jess. And just to answer a couple quick questions, the PowerPoints that you're going to see here this afternoon will be shared on the CHAPA website. So no need to kind of scramble and write everything down. Jess is giving you lots of really important information and, kind of hearkening back to my days as a planning director. I just would suggest, it may take a couple times to absorb all of the information that is contained in that deck, but all of it is valuable and worth going back to. We're going to take questions and do questions and answer after Ryoko's presentation. So I'd like to introduce Rieko Hayashi, the director of the LIP program, for her presentation. Thanks, Rieko.
Thanks. Thanks to Jess for her excellent overview of the 40B process. And so I'm going to talk about, one of the programs, one of the 40B programs, which is called the Local Initiative Program. And this is out of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. So next slide. So what is LIP, or Local Initiative Program? This is the program that encourages locally driven efforts to create affordable housing. It falls under Chapter 40B and was created in response to opposition to 40B and the development of affordable housing projects. LIP provides a mechanism to encourage locally supported affordable housing where the municipality is engaged in the development of the project prior to any application to EOHLC. Next slide. Okay. So there are two types of LIP projects. One, the 40B, sometimes nicknamed Friendly 40B. So these are projects where the developer is trying to obtain a comprehensive permit. And one of the critical components of that is the municipality must support the application, must be signed by the chief executive officer. We encourage any other types of support, if they're local funds or, any other type of local support. The other type, maybe not as well known, that does fall under LIP are the local action units. And these are projects where the developer's not seeking a comprehensive permit, most likely a special permit of some kind, and a municipal action is required, and that the special permit or the zoning bylaw or financial contributions can be considered the municipal action, the local action, sorry. Okay, next slide. So some examples of LIP projects: new construction, building conversion, substantial rehab, large and small rental projects, home ownership, first-time home buyer buy-down programs, nonprofit sponsored projects. So some of these projects, may fall under the 40B purview, but some may fall under the local action purview, where, as I mentioned, projects come in already permitted. So it could, be something that is technically already built. Next slide. LIP is a program that is popular and growing. In the 10 years I've worked for EOHLC, I've really seen a boom in the number of applications. Since its inception in the 1980s, approximately 40,000 units of housing have been approved, of which almost 8,000 are affordable. Of those units, 4,076 were local action units and 294 were LIP 40B units. So as you can see, the local action unit program is the program that gets the bulk of the applications. In 2023, 4,370 units were approved under LIP. And these are projects that are all across the Commonwealth, you know, from Nantucket to Wellesley, of all kinds. Next slide. Why is LIP appealing to housing partners? Well, the units will count on the subsidized housing inventory. These are locally endorsed projects, so the community has a say in the early stages prior to application. It's a non-competitive process. It's fairly simple, since there's no state subsidy involved. And I just want to reiterate that we are the only state subsidy program where we're not offering any financial component to it. The comprehensive permit, as just mentioned, is a good vehicle for consolidating waivers. So that's something that would apply to not only LIP, but other programs. Next slide. So the project requirements for a LIP project would be that the market in affordable homeownership units must be indistinguishable from the exterior. Affordable units must be distributed proportionately throughout the development. All amenities must be made available to all residents. And 10% of the units in a family development must be 3-bedroom and be distributed proportionately throughout the project, both by location and income tier. Next. For the LIP 40 application process, it's a good idea to contact me before you submit the application. The requirements in the application, again, the municipality has to sign the application. There's a fee, there's a 30-day review process. There's an appraisal that has to be commissioned by the state. There's a site visit, and this is something that's not particular to LIP, but it's, again, just reiterating as part of the application process. And as Jess mentioned, once we approve the application, we issue a project eligibility letter for which then the developer can apply for the comprehensive permit. Next slide. So, again, this is sort of reiterating what Jess was saying, but with the project eligibility letter, the developer can then go to the ZBA to apply for the comprehensive permit. Once they obtain that, we need to approve the affirmative fair housing marketing and tenant selection plan. As with the other agencies, we do have a regulatory agreement, which is the restriction on the project. And in our case, that is an agreement between the municipality, the developer, and the state. We do have quite a backlog of applications, so, you know, you can expect that it can take at least several months. And with, in our case, with the approval of the regulatory agreement and the final documentation, this does serve as the final approval. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch upon the other type of LIP, which is the local action unit application process, but my colleague, Ali Sabatino, is also going to elaborate on this in more detail in her presentation in a couple weeks. And she's probably going to do a better job than me, but because it is a part of the LIP, I'm just going to touch on it right now. So as I said, if a developer is not trying to obtain a comprehensive permit, and the town does want to move forward with the project, and they have a municipal action such as special permit or CPA funded project, they can submit an application, which does also have to be signed with the municipality, and have the other requirements of the affirmative fair housing marketing, and the regulatory agreement. Next slide. Some examples of local actions that I already mentioned are zoning-based approval, special permit, that can include as of right approval, which is defined in state law as development that may proceed under a zoning ordinance or bylaw without the need for a special permit, variance, zoning amendment, waiver, or other discretionary zoning approval. Conveyance of publicly owned land, or utilization of community preservation or local or trust funds or something, local. Next slide. So, with all these projects, one of the components that's very critical to the review is the affirmative fair housing marketing piece, because we do have the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. So when we review the marketing, we do want to make sure that the marketing is maximizing the opportunity for persons protected under fair housing laws through marketing, application, and selection policies and procedures. Next slide. And so this is an outline of all the different components of the marketing plan. I'm just going to quickly go through them. As I said again, this is something that Allie is also going to be going into more detail when she does her local action unit presentation. But so the marketing plan has to include a description of the outreach, the advertising, application materials, informational materials, eligibility requirements, lottery and residential selection procedures. And if there's a local preference, there has to be a clear description of that. And I would say the marketing is probably one of the things that we pay most attention to, because the application itself is fairly simple and straightforward. The regulatory agreement is pretty boilerplate, but the marketing really speaks to, the description of the project and how it's going to be marketed. Next slide. And so, one of the reasons projects do go through the LIP process is communities want these units on their subsidized housing inventory. So in order to just going through the requirements of the subsidized housing inventory, they require one, that they be approved through an eligible state or federal subsidy program. And so in this case, it would be the LIP program. That the units be affordable to households at or below 80% of their median income. So it can be, below that. And have a long-term use restriction, and the regulatory agreement, which I referred to, would be that restriction, and are subject to an affirmative fair housing marketing and resident selection plan. Next slide. So what is counted on the SHI? If it's a rental project, if at least 25% of the units are at 80% or below, or at least 20% are at 50% of AMI or below, then all of the units will count. If it's an ownership project, only the affordable units would count on the SHI. Next slide. So here's my contact information. And, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. We're always happy to speak with you. My colleague, Allie Sabatino, is the local action unit coordinator. We work hand in hand with legal. Margot LeClaire is the counsel that oversees the subsidized housing inventory as well as fair housing. I know that's a lot of detail, but as I said, the review is really what's key with the LIP process. We're not offering any financial subsidy, but it's actually the review and the technical assistance that makes or qualifies us as a subsidy program.
Thank you so much, Rieko. It's nice to see everybody. Okay, now we have the multi-layered quilt of Zoom participants here. It's great to be able to see everybody's faces. We do have some questions in the chat. Please, if you have additional questions, put them in the chat. And now we have a good amount of time to go through some questions and answers, which we're hopeful will be helpful to you all. And again, Katie Lacey has joined. She's a senior planner at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to just start, providing an overview of the questions. There's been some commentary and some answers provided about seasonal workers and especially low-income seasonal workers. And the CHAPA staff has correctly noted that the Affordable Homes Act has a seasonal communities designation and a whole bunch of provisions specifically aimed at seasonal communities, which includes at least communities in Berkshire County, as well as on Cape Cod and in Dukes County. And so that work is at EOHLC. We are convening a Seasonal Communities Advisory Council. They will be up and running, we hope, in December, and there will be guidelines issued by our agency in consultation with that advisory committee. I'd like to just take a moment to do a little bit of an advertisement for my colleague, Eric Shupin, who is going to be describing in, I believe, session 2, the Affordable Homes Act. And since seasonal communities is one of the provisions in the Affordable Homes Act, I would just encourage you, if you'd like more information about that, to tune in for that presentation. Seasonal communities is in the Livable Communities division that I oversee. So as we continue to develop it, I am also a contact for that. But you'll hear more about that from Eric. There was another question about housing production plans. So there were some other questions that I think were answered because people asked about friendly 40Bs, which Rieko covered by talking about the LIP and the local action unit programs. There was a question about housing production plans, affectionately known by us bureaucrats who like acronyms as HPPs, and that they last for 5 years. And so that is something under the 40B law and regulations and guidelines. So I just want to be clear, there are 3 things with 40B. There's the statute, there are regulations, and there are program guidelines, and all of them work together. So those require that a housing production plan, if you'd like to remain, have a housing production plan consistently, that you update it every 5 years. The question referred to it as a renewal. I would not call it a renewal. I would really call it an update. It requires you to redo all of the data and all of the analysis. It's not like renewing a book at the library where you just say, I'd like a renewal. There is, you have to follow all of the requirements to put into that plan, do an analysis of demographics, identify gaps, but affordability gaps that may exist in your community, and propose strategies and mapped areas to solve those problems to maintain your subsidized housing inventory or get to your subsidized housing inventory 10%. So I just wanted to make it clear that it's not kind of as easy as a renewal. And the question was how often does EOHLC deny housing production plan updates? And I would say that we work with communities to try and have it so that we're not approving your housing production plan. We want to help you guys do it right. We want to help them meet all the requirements and that are in the rules. And so I think it's infrequent that we are denying a housing production plan. What you might be thinking of is that we also certify housing production plans when communities make progress towards their subsidized housing inventory goal. And if they make a certain amount of progress in 1 year or in 2 years, they can have a certified housing production plan, which gives you a safe harbor for 1 or 2 years from 40B because of the progress that you've made. And I will say that those are quite complicated analysis, they're fact-based, and so we do look at those, and those certifications are not always approved, but they're very specific to the individual requests. So having covered that, I'd just like to look to my panelists. Does anybody have anything else to add about housing production plans? Okay, seeing none, I'll move to the next question. And Rieko, this is coming to you. Can a LIP project rehab or expand housing authority units?
I don't think I've ever had that request before. I don't know. I mean, they would be. I don't know.
The 40B guidelines do allow for rehabilitation, but I guess you're assuming that whatever rehab that is proposed is increasing the density on the property, right? I mean, that's really what 40B is for.
Not just
So,
rehabbing. Yeah.
It does allow for rehab, but
Yeah.
I guess it would just case by case.
I don't think. I mean, I know, you know, state funds have been used for modernization or rehab of housing authority units, but I don't know that anything has ever come through LIP.
If my colleagues
we
Laura
don't offer any
Schufield,
money, we don't offer any funding for that. So, I mean, that's because we don't have any funding connected with us. Yeah. Well, sorry, go ahead, Katie.
I said if my colleagues from MHP who work in this area are on the call, they can, you know, we can get answers, but I suspect it may not be eligible because the funding is coming from either the state, it's coming from the state, in which case the subsidizing agency still would be EOHLC, but it would be the other part of EOHLC, not the LIP program.
Yeah.
But I think this brings up a question of, you know, friendly versus unfriendly. There are 40B applications that go through MassHousing, MHP, the tax credit process that are friendly in spirit, in that the municipality supports them. And it sounds like the question is asking that, you know, can this be something that the municipality supports? And I would say, yes, absolutely.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be opposition if it's whether or not the municipality does support it. Friendly in that the municipality is supporting it, but not necessarily meaning that there aren't going to be abutters who oppose it. I know Denise is on the call. Denise Johnson is on the call, so she can attest to that.
Thanks, folks. It looks like also Elizabeth Rust, who runs the Regional Housing Services Office in the Metro West area, is noting that she's helped housing authorities create units, but maybe not through this process, but that is possible. And I know our public housing staff here at EOHLC are always looking for opportunities if housing authorities want to work with them to expand the number of units, or, you know, redevelop areas with a little bit higher density if they have extra and surplus land that they're not using. So there's a variety of different ways there. We have, I'm going to take one question out of order, but it's a question about housing production plans. And are there any grants to help do housing production plans? The answer to that is yes. The Community Planning Grant Program, which is a capital grant program in the Livable Communities Division, is an annual application cycle, and we have funded many housing production plans. That is through the Community One Stop for Growth, which can be found at mass.gov by searching for Community One Stop for Growth. It is an annual application which is due in May. Typically in May, it opens up in January, and program guidelines and information about those programs are promulgated in early January. So I expect in January 20, we just did the awards for this year's grant round, in which I'm sure we included some housing production plans, but the next opportunity for the community planning grant program will be next May, but keep your eyes open in January when the Community One Stop for Growth program is opened up. Katie, I don't know if MHP also provides any funding for housing production plans. Okay, yeah. So
No, but I know it's bread and butter for the RPAs who do a terrific job.
That's a great point. You also have
with their district local technical assistance funding.
Exactly. So I think that DLTA, district local technical assistance funding, those calls for proposals often come out around this time of year or at the turn of the calendar year, where you can apply for special assistance from the regional planning agency to get work like that done. Thanks, Katie. Rieko and Jess, we have a kind of long question from Barbara St. Andre from the town of Medway. I'll just read it to you and look to you guys if you might provide some answers to this. It's an excellent question. We've been asked to certify that a Chapter 40B rental project is in compliance with its affordability requirements in order to allow for the sale of the development. What information does EOHLC need for this certification, and how would a municipality be able to verify that the project is compliance with affordability requirements? I'm putting this question specifically to Rieko, but broadly to Jess and Rieko and Katie about ongoing responsibilities of municipalities for affordable units, in particular with the LIP program. So Rieko, let's start with you.
Okay, so whoever is monitoring the project should be submitting annual reports to the town and EOHLC, certifying that, the certifications, the tenants have been recertified and the project is in compliance. So although I know, the regulatory agreement says in some cases may word it as the town, it's generally a another agent that is actually doing the rent recertification and then submitting that report to the town. And if they haven't receiving those reports, I mean, that's usually the basis. What the town uses is the basis to determine that the developer has been in compliance and will approve the transfer. We recently discovered there was a project where that wasn't being done, and so we are dealing with a developer who wasn't in compliance, and so we're requiring them to comply with a compliance agreement and all the terms before we do approve a sale.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, if in fact there wasn't a third-party monitoring agent that had been hired by the town to do that work, it was the town's obligation, the town would be looking for information from the developer or the property manager regarding, the folks living in the eligibility of the folks living in the affordable units. So the town would be responsible for getting the information from the developer, but the developer should be the one, or the property manager, or whomever they've hired to do the certifications should be the ones providing you that information.
Barbara should feel free to contact me directly if she has any other follow-up questions.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I think it is really it's an important thing to talk about here, is that what are the ongoing responsibilities, and Katie, what maybe you could talk a little bit about the subsidizing agency and what is the subsidizing agency's role in ongoing monitoring of affordable units, and how do you work with municipalities?
It does differ from subsidizing agency to subsidizing agency. I can speak to MHP. We do our own monitoring for the period of the affordability restriction. The developer or property manager pays. We have in-house capability to handle that. I'm actually not quite sure what the regular reporting is, but I know that it's available, you know, if the municipality is interested. I think the developer is obligated to report to the municipality. And then my memory, and Jess can chime in here, is that MHP also does its own monitoring for projects. That's correct? For rental projects?
For MassHousing, for both our finance projects and the NEF portfolio.
Right.
MassHousing does the monitoring in-house. So again, we're requesting information from the development team annually for the term of 30 years, which is required by the regulations, that all the folks living in the affordable units are in fact eligible.
Thank you, guys. And I just want to note here that it really takes a village to answer these questions about this program and the related programs. CHAPA staff is providing answers in the chat. EOHLC's folks are providing some answers in the chat. One question is, has a municipality ever achieved a safe harbor with the land area minimum, or we call it the GLAM, the general land area minimum? And Phil DiMartino of my staff has indicated that Watertown has achieved this, but it is few and far between that municipalities are meeting that standard. Let's see. So thank you, Phil, for providing that information and crowdsourcing. Let's see, MAPC staff is noting that their technical assistance program, which is the equivalent of what we've been talking about as DLTA, they call it the technical assistance program, or TAP. That program application period is open now for any but of the 101 cities and towns that are in the MAPC region. So thank you very much, Sukanya, for alerting us to that as well. You know, in general, we're trying to answer kind of general overview questions here. If you have a really specific question, we may point you to a specific staff person to follow up about a very specific situation. Jess, could you answer, you covered that whole process, but could you just remind us, when you're talking about a developer coming to the subsidizing agency for that project eligibility letter with its first proposal, from that point through the construction of units, what is the timeline typically?
So I think ideally, and again, I just like to remind everybody that, you know, 40B was established as to be an expedited permitting process. Over the years, it's become a little bit more complicated than that with litigation and things like that. So ideally, a project would receive a project eligibility letter and then present a final approval letter to a town for building permits within a year or 18 months. Because litigation is involved so often, you know, it can take anywhere from 3 years to 5 years. There have been some projects that have hung around for 15 to 20 years. It's funny that it's interesting to me that the interested parties even, you know, wanted to remain involved for that long. It just feels like forever. But yeah, it should take less than 2 years if from soup to nuts it goes swimmingly. Yeah,
and certainly the economy plays a big role too. You know, during the Great Recession, many projects just went on hold for 5-6 years. And I think similarly with some of the challenges we're seeing now around financing costs, there can be a delay, but that's a bigger, you know, that's sort of out of our control to a certain extent.
Thanks, Jess and Katie. Rieko, I have a question about for LIP projects. If a chief elected official in a community is applying for a LIP application and they have to, you know, actually propose it to you, can the Zoning Board of Appeals deny that project?
Yes, I mean, and it does, and it does happen. But the developer can then, you know, appeal that decision, or sometimes they do negotiate, you know, and kind of come back with some type of proposed modification, but it does, yeah, it definitely does happen.
Okay. And again, I just want to encourage folks to put any questions in the chat. We're starting to run out of questions, and which is fine. Maybe you guys have learned everything in this presentation, which would be great. But please don't be shy to ask a question. This is a Rieko and a Jess and a Katie question. If I want to apply for financing through one of the state programs, can it go through a LIP program? Can it be a LIP?
I can answer that. No. So our program is really intended for projects that are not seeking any state financing. Other programs like tax credits have their own requirements, and people apply for those funds on a competitive funding round basis. Whereas LIP project applications are, you can apply at any time. There's no limitation on that. So it just, they have different requirements. They have a different approval process. So if somebody were to be seeking funding, we would have them, like if it's tax credits, we would direct them to the tax credit program. And you would actually get your 40B approval through the tax credit program, not through LIP.
Great, thank you. MassHousing partnership, anything to add to that? Do you get requests for this kind of thing? Is this a confusion that people have?
There is some
We do.
confusion, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's easier to just keep it with one subsidizing agency. Layering regulatory agreements and program requirements gets really complicated. So even if it's not, Katie mentioned this earlier, but even if it's technically a friendly 40B, the developer can seek approvals through another subsidizing agency. It's just, and sometimes in the example we provided earlier that, that the Board of Selectmen was supportive, but the ZBA was not. Sometimes if there's that kind of a disagreement, it will end up at another subsidizing agency.
Yeah, I do think the rule of thumb is that if it's getting state financing through the tax credit program or anything through the funding round, that department of HLC is acting as they're performing the duties of the subsidizing agency. It's just, that's the system. So we do sometimes get requests to do project eligibility letters, and then we find out midway through, oh, we're going to be applying for tax credits. We have to say, no, you've got to go talk to the other part of HLC. Maybe you guys could just remind me of the exact name.
Housing Development Division.
Housing Development Programs, yeah.
Yeah, great. And that's the division. Actually, Rieko is embedded in that division because they work a lot with developers, whether it's through the LIP, local action, or tax credit.
Yeah, I would like to elevate one of the questions I saw that I know it's really hard to answer. And as an interagency group where we all meet and talk about this, it's, it comes up all the time, which is, can municipalities push back on rent increases that are allowed under HUD, and state guidelines for 80% median income, but seem high? So I'd love to know if you guys get inquiries about this. We do, for sure.
Yeah. So affordability is in the direct purview of the subsidizing agency and the program requirements. It's actually an SJC case called Amesbury that designates the subsidizing agency as the authority on the affordability of the project. And 40B really it's a moderate income program. I mean, it's 80% AMI and it's 25% of the units, or 20% of the units at 50% of the AMI. And that really all goes back to financial feasibility of a project. But no, to answer the question simply, the subsidizing agency really has the say in terms of the affordability and what's required from the developer stage.
For LIP projects, the regulatory agreement says EOHLC and the municipality have to approve the rents. Although they say, you know, it says that the rent calculation is, you know, 30% of 80%.
Right.
The AMI, technically the municipality, EOHLC do have that review, ability to review that. So we have seen, you know, particularly since COVID, a lot of pushback.
Right.
And I would say in most cases, the developer has been pretty agreeable because the rents are too high. You know, they've gotten, you know, out of control. So,
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, though. Again, it goes back to the original approvals, the project's financial feasibility. And so you would really need a developer to agree to lower those affordable rents to require that.
Yeah,
but we
that's
also
right.
have, you know, I mean, like Ally's projects don't have, I mean, they may be like 5% affordable, you know, they're not 40Bs. So, you know, 5% of 200 units. I mean, you know, why not, you know, offer more modest rents. It's not like 25 or 25.
Well, thank you. And I apologize. I apparently missed a couple questions and more questions are pouring in. So thanks. Good job. Good job, team. We didn't think that you guys would be too quiet or shy. And so there is a question about the existing 40B statute and regs about the subsidized housing inventory threshold is 10% of units being affordable, and that's how you achieve your compliance with the law and not be vulnerable to applications from the developers. And the question was, is there any discussion about increasing this? We really appreciate this comment. Of course, we think about this a lot. And so please just stay tuned. There's also a question right after that was the discussion, to have a discussion about having 25% of affordable units in rental projects allow the entire rental project to count, all of the units in the rental project counting towards that 100%. Towards the subsidized housing inventory. And is there any discussion of changing that? Again, we really appreciate these comments. These are helpful for us as we consider and think about what are the next steps. You know, we've have this Affordable Homes Act bond bill, which has us very busy doing lots of great new implementation of great new laws. We're also putting together a state housing plan and have an Unlocking Housing Unlocking Housing Production Commission, which are taking comments just like this and thinking about them and making recommendations towards our agencies. So we'll take these comments back to our leadership. Let me get going on some of the new questions that have come in. Thank you, guys. So one of the questions is, Jessica's early slide showed a 40B application going through MassHousing to get an eligibility letter before a comprehensive permit application, but thought through EOHLC was the only path. Do all of them still need to go through EOHLC? Jess, do you want to just add some clarification here?
Yep. No, yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are 4 state subsidizing agencies. All have been designated by HLC to issue those approvals. But MassHousing, MHP, Mass Development, and HLC are all avenues for project eligibility letters.
Thank you, Jess. If you come away with nothing else from this presentation, we want to make sure that you understand the interplay and the roles of the subsidizing agencies, but they each are somewhat independent in that matter. Another question and comment is, there is a need for accessible affordable housing in Massachusetts. How are the implementing agencies ensuring these projects are meeting the minimum accessibility requirements? And here I'm presuming we're talking about Americans with Disability Accessibility. Is there a resource that explains which programs and funding sources fit which accessibility requirements? I'm going to stop there. There's another question here, but Jess, Rieko, Katie, do you want to comment on ADA and accessibility in the projects that you're financing and approving?
There are no specific requirements for 40B development, but developers have to meet, state and federal laws in all of these developments. So the only waivers that developers are seeking are local waivers. So all state and federal laws when it comes to anything need to be met, including, accessibility. But again, I think it depends on, the financing that you're receiving and the funding source and the subsidizing agency. They might have, differing requirements.
Yeah,
Thank you. And
But
that
does get, the subsidizing agency does review that pretty carefully when they're reviewing not just the Pell application, but the final approval application and the affirmative fair housing marketing plan to ensure that the ADA requirements, which I think is what, 5%? The monitoring folks are on top of this to make sure that those are being complied with. Typically, a lot of the developers go a little above and beyond that, I've noticed, just because there's a huge demand.
And of course, requests for reasonable accommodations always need to be made.
yeah. Gonna add, yeah.
Okay. There was a follow-up question about the LIP affirmative fair housing requirement include information on the design and construction requirements of the FHA. Rieko?
I understand the question. What?
I'm just reading the question. Does the LIP affirmative fair housing requirement, I think fair housing marketing plan,
Yeah.
include information on the design and construction requirements of the FHA?
What's FHA? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure if Katie Dennis is to unmute and ask her question a little bit more clearly.
Pardon me?
There's the person who's asked this question is named
Fair Housing Act.
The Fair Housing Act. Yeah. And so I think this is a follow-up on the ADA question.
Okay.
So I think it's really about the Fair Housing Act and ADA and how they interact.
Yeah. Well, when the guidelines for affirmative fair housing marketing plans was drafted in the 40B guidelines, I think they incorporated state and federal laws into that. And our great fair housing attorney, Margot LeClaire, who also oversees the SHI, was pretty much involved with that. So a lot of the language in the requirements we have in our affirmative fair housing marketing plans comes from that and incorporates that.
Thank you. There was a question about will the new fair housing office that Secretary Augustus previewed in his opening comments, and would they be involved in the affirmative fair housing affirmative marketing plan? Rieko, could you just touch on that?
I haven't really heard that office would be involved with marketing plan reviews, or?
It's currently done by the legal counsel that's assigned to help with that. And so they're the ones that are looking at it. And so I think a little bit is TBD as that office gets up and going.
Yeah, I mean, right now, LIP staff review marketing plans. We have as I said, we have guidelines, 40B guidelines, and we, pretty much follow that in the review. And we enlist, trained lottery agents that have to go through the MHP affirmative fair housing marketing training. But if there's anything additional, I'm not aware of it. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, and at MHP, our legal staff and property management staff review affirmative fair housing marketing plan.
There's another question, with all the new and existing funding programs for affordable housing and energy efficiency, is there one place where all the various funding programs can be listed? Sometimes we need a roadmap to figure out which programs fits the developments that we're working on. And I really appreciate that question. You know, I don't know of one single website that has it. We are continuing to add to the EOHLC web pages that exist. We do have the heating and it used to be called LIHEAP, heating and low income heating and cooling program, heating assistance program. We're now just calling it the HEAP program. It starts on Friday, November 1st is the beginning of that program. So I think I would suggest you could look up heating energy and heating energy assistance program on the EOHLC web pages or on the mass.gov website, which I think has a really good search feature. So that program is just starting. It is typically implemented with local community action agencies. So those are the folks who kind of are implementing that program on the ground and providing answers in real time to local folks. So the person that's asking that question, you might want to find out which is the community action agency that applies to your area or region and reach out to them for more detailed information. But we are working to try and make sure that there's links and back and forth between lots of different programs that we offer and make it a little bit easier. Again, sometimes those community action agencies, which are on the ground in local areas, are the best folks to do that because they deal with multiple programs and they have a good understanding and a grasp of how they work together. I think we've already addressed the question about change. I mean, maybe I'll just make sure when my panelists can a 40B change their area median income after already being built and go from 25% at 80% of AMI to 20% at 50 AMI and then be counted as in entirety. So these are the two different options that the developers have when they come forward for a project. And they can either do 25% of the units affordable at 80% of area median income or a lower percentage, 20% that's affordable at 50% of the AMI, just to explain that question to folks. Jess, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, as long as the programmatic requirements allow for it, I don't see why there would be an issue. But again, you'd have to ask the subsidizing agency with regard to under NEF that would be allowable, and it would just be an amendment to the regulatory agreement that had been reported.
Okay. A really practical question. What kind of commitment do developers need to make regarding minimum ongoing property maintenance? And I presume this is within a 40B project. Jess and Katie, anything you guys do as you're monitoring?
Certainly during construction.
Yeah, so the comprehensive permit
involved.
really covers the existing structures and how they're maintained, with accordance again, the comprehensive permit and its conditions. That's sort of outside of the scope of the subsidizing agency and what we oversee.
Thank you. I know this is sometimes an issue or a perceived issue from folks. Sukanya from MAPC has a question. I'm curious about utility allowances within rental local action units that are required to be part of the annual reporting to EOHLC and the community. Is there any scope to expand these allowances to include additional costs like parking or internet as a way to help reduce the overall rent burdens for tenants in the local action units?
So after the unit is occupied, she's wondering if there could be a further reduction in the rent to encompass other services.
I think she's actually saying, could there be an expansion? Because there are additional things, because utilities now have, like internet is a new utility that may or may not be addressed.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's possible some things could be negotiated. I think the problem is that, when we initially set the rents or the prices, we kind of incorporate those things. Like, is parking included? are, what fees are included when we agree to a certain rent. So then if, at a later point, they wanted to include that, they would have to, I
Yeah,
wouldn't say it's
I think that-
impossible, but
I
yeah.
think that question is sort of bigger than 40Bs because
Yeah.
developers are asked to use, the utility allowance projections that are provided by their local housing authorities. And so, and those are sort of, I think, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but housing authorities sort of answer to HLC. So it's kind of a bigger question than 40B. When you're talking about utility allowances, you also, I think we have to start considering, sustainable features and how those impact utility allowances. So it's a bigger question. I've heard murmurings of conversations, but right now it is, we do calculate the rents based on the housing authorities numbers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Jess. I'm not seeing other questions, and I think we want to leave just a little time for wrap up. Thank you very much, panelists, Rieko, Jess, Katie. Really appreciate this. I know that your presentations and answering the questions are really helpful for local governments, local advocates, developers who may be on this call to try and understand, these complicated programs that we're running and the rules that are needed to be followed. I want to encourage folks to stay tuned for the next two sessions. And Rachel, may I hand it to you to describe those next two sessions?
And I will actually turn it over to Carol Marine. Thank you, Chris, and thank you. That was an amazing panel.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Chris, Rieko, Jess, and Katie. It was an amazing panel. And I think you did two things. You demystified the role of subsidizing agencies, and you highlighted the complexities of all of the programs. So thank you for staying on and going through the Q&A. And we will provide the PowerPoints, and Ed Marchand has provided a 40B 101. We'll also add to the website. I just popped in the chat a very brief survey. It's like 4 questions that you could probably finish before I highlight the next 2 programs. So next week on Wednesday at 3, we will hear from, we will focus on fair housing. The program will open with an overview of the Affordable Homes Act by Eric Shupin. We will then move to a fair housing discussion, fair housing now, and what we might expect with some of our new tools like the Office of Fair Housing and the Trust Fund. That will be moderated by Whitney Demetrius, and our speakers will include Esme Caramello, the Director of the Housing Affordability Unit at the Office of the Attorney General, Liz Rust, the Director at Regional Housing Services Office, and Matt Robanya from Boston Communities. Following that, our last will wrap up on November 13th, and we will focus on incorporating affordability with inclusionary zoning. I know it's something Secretary Augustus referenced earlier. We will hear an opening from Andrea Aldana, the Chief Program Officer at Community Development Partnership, and she will highlight some local initiatives that they have done on the Cape. We will then have a moderated discussion. Katie Lacey will run the discussion. We will include David Cashman from SEB Housing, a monitoring agent, Matt Latanzi, Director of Planning and Development at City of Everett. They've just initiated an inclusionary zoning program. Ali Sabatino, a housing specialist, and Alexis Smith, regional planner from MAPC. And you can see the, hopefully that is the link, if I got it correctly, to all of the speakers. And of course, please stay involved with CHAPA. We all can advocate better together, so check out the opportunities. We have lots of committees on our website, our Young Professionals Network. Join the Affordable Massachusetts Coalition and generally support our work. And at the local and regional level, talk to your friends and neighbors and show up for community meetings where housing will be discussed. It's been proven that communities do better when there's a can-do voice in the discussion. So please join in at the local level. And with that, again, thank you to the great panelists, and thank you panelists for sharing your contact information. I bet you will get more questions. And if the secretary's staff is still on, thank you for opening. And with that, we will see you in a week. Take care, everybody.